In the summer of 1977, a pastor named Thomas Albright walked out of his small-town parsonage one night and was never seen again. For 47 years, no one knew what had become of him. His disappearance haunted his family, fractured his church, and whispered through the streets of his town like a ghost story people told but never understood. But everything changed when, during a renovation, his old house gave up its secret. Beneath the warped wooden floorboards of his study, a journal was found. His journal. And what was written inside was not just unsettling, it was terrifying. But to understand this moment, we need to go back to where it all began. The night of July 12, 1977, was an ordinary summer night in the small town of Ashford, where the neighbors knew one another by name. Everyone went to the same grocery store. Everyone knew the pastor. That pastor was Thomas Albright. He was 38 years old, with a calm presence and a voice that carried in the church sanctuary without ever needing a microphone. People described him as steady, kind, and someone who would give the shirt off his back. He lived with his wife, Mary, and their 2 children, a boy and a girl who were barely into grade school, in the parsonage right beside Ashford Community Church. On the evening he disappeared, dinner had been simple fried chicken, green beans, cornbread. His wife remembered him not finishing his plate, saying he had work to do in his study. He kissed his kids goodnight. He carried a small notebook under his arm. And then, at some point after nightfall, he was gone. The house was quiet when Mary noticed it. She had fallen asleep on the couch waiting for him to come back from his study, but when she checked the room, the lamp was still on. His Bible was open. His reading glasses were resting on the desk. His notebook was gone. Outside, the summer air was thick with humidity, crickets chirping. The church stood silent in the dark. His car was still in the driveway. His shoes were by the door. It was as if he had simply stepped out into the night and dissolved into thin air. Mary would later tell police that she thought he had gone for a walk, maybe to clear his head. He sometimes did. But when the hours stretched on, and midnight turned into 2 a.m., fear began to creep in. She called her sister. Then, she called the police. The first officer arrived around 3 a.m. He knocked gently on the door so as not to wake the children. Mary, pale and trembling, let him in. "He's never done this before," she whispered. "He's never just left." The officer checked the house. Nothing was out of place. No signs of struggle, no broken locks, no footprints in the damp soil outside. It was one of those moments that feels almost unreal, where everything looks perfectly normal, but the absence of one person turns the world upside down. By sunrise, word had already spread through Ashford. The pastor was missing. Neighbors gathered in hushed groups on front porches, speculating in low voices. Some insisted he must have gone to visit a parishioner in need. Others muttered darker things, that maybe he'd run off, maybe he had secrets no one knew. But the truth was simpler and stranger. He had vanished, leaving behind nothing but questions. The church bells rang that morning as they always did, calling people to prayer. But instead of the usual sermons and hymns, the sanctuary filled with silence, then murmurs, then prayers, spoken in shaky voices. A town without its pastor felt suddenly exposed, as though a piece of its very foundation had been pulled away. Police began their search. They questioned Mary again. They checked his desk, his drawers, his car. They found no note, no sign of where he had gone. His wallet and keys were still in the house. His study window had been cracked open, the curtains fluttering slightly in the summer breeze. That was all. By the end of the first 24 hours, people were already whispering theories. Some said he'd been kidnapped. Others said he'd taken his own life and gone off into the woods. A few, though, they said it quietly suggested maybe he hadn't been the man everyone thought he was. For Mary, the hours blurred into each other. She paced the house. She kept listening for his footsteps on the porch. She made coffee and didn't drink it. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold, staring at the back door. When the police organized the first search party, she went with them, though she could barely walk straight from exhaustion. Neighbors carried flashlights, calling his name into the woods. Dogs barked and strained against their leashes. Somewhere out in the darkness, owls called back, but not Thomas, never Thomas. By the second night, panic had truly set in. Mary put her children to bed, told them Daddy had gone to help someone, that he would be back soon. She closed the door and sat with her back against it, fighting tears. The parsonage felt haunted. The empty study glowed in the dark, the lamp still burning, the Bible still open, the glasses still waiting. It would be weeks before investigators admitted they had no leads, months before the case would grow cold, years before the house would give up its secret, and decades before anyone would read the words Thomas had left behind, hidden where no one thought to look. But on that first night, in the stillness of July 12, 1977, all anyone knew was that Pastor Thomas Albright had vanished, and nothing in Ashford would ever be the same again. Before the world knew him as the man who disappeared, Pastor Thomas Albright was simply Thomas. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't the kind of preacher who pounded the pulpit or shook the rafters with his voice. He wasn't the type to demand attention when he entered a room. If anything, Thomas blended in a modest man in pressed shirts, a man who carried himself with quiet confidence. But in a town like Ashford, sometimes that's exactly what people trusted most. Ashford, back in 1977, was a postcard version of small-town America. The streets were lined with tall oaks, their branches forming archways over cracked sidewalks. On Saturday mornings, the smell of biscuits and bacon drifted from open kitchen windows. Families waved to one another from porches, and children played barefoot in the grass until dusk, when lightning bugs blinked against the night. There were fewer than 3,000 people in the entire town. Everyone knew everyone, and everyone, whether they were churchgoers or not, knew Pastor Thomas. He'd come to Ashford in the early 70s, freshly graduated from seminary. The church had been struggling then, attendance low, the roof leaking, a sense of gloom hanging over the congregation. Within months of his arrival, things began to change. It wasn't that his sermons were fiery. They weren't. They were simple, plain-spoken, but they carried weight because people felt like he understood them. He didn't talk down to his congregation. He talked to them like neighbors sitting at a kitchen table. He knew their stories, their hardships, their joys. By the time 1977 rolled around, Ashford Community Church was thriving. Sunday mornings filled the pews. The choir swelled with voices. Children's laughter spilled from the basement during Bible study. And at the center of it all was Pastor Thomas, smiling his soft smile, listening more than he spoke. Mary, his wife, was his quiet partner. She didn't crave the spotlight either. She kept the household running, baked pies for church events, and was known for always remembering birthdays. Together, they seemed like the perfect pair, steady, dependable, the kind of couple people pointed to as an example of how to build a family. But perfection, especially in small towns, is rarely what it seems. There were whispers, even before Thomas vanished. Not loud ones, not public, but whispers nonetheless. Some said he worked too much, spent more hours in his study than with his family. Others said he seemed distracted sometimes, distant even while standing in front of the congregation. A few muttered that he carried burdens he never shared, secrets written into the furrow of his brow when he thought no one was looking. Still, if you had asked the people of Ashford in the summer of 1977 who Pastor Thomas Albright was, they would have painted a picture of a man devoted to his God, his family, and his town. His days followed a rhythm. Mornings often began early, with coffee at the small kitchen table, the newspaper folded neatly beside him. He liked it quiet before the children woke, before the phone started ringing with parishioners needing counsel. By mid-morning, he could usually be found at the church office, working on sermons or writing notes of encouragement to members of the congregation. Afternoons were filled with hospital visits, community meetings, and home calls. Evenings often brought him back to his study, where the yellow glow of his lamp became a familiar sight through the window. That study was his sanctuary. It was lined with shelves of books, theology texts, old commentaries, and worn novels. On the desk sat his Bible, underlined and marked with notes, and a stack of journals he'd kept over the years. No one knew what he wrote in them, not even Mary. She once asked him about it, and he just smiled, tapping the closed cover of one of the little notebooks. Thoughts, he said, prayers, reflections. And that was that. If only she had known. But back then, there was no reason to question. Life in Ashford rolled along at its steady pace. Summer brought church picnics in the park, with lemonade sweating in glass pitchers and children running through sprinklers. Fall brought harvest festivals, hay rides, and potluck dinners in the fellowship hall. Winter brought candlelit services and snow that blanketed the church steeple in white. The church wasn't just a place of worship. It was the heartbeat of the community. and Thomas was at the center of it all, which is why his disappearance struck the town like a lightning bolt. This wasn't just a man who had gone missing. This was the man who prayed over newborns, who buried the dead, who counseled marriages on the brink of breaking. He was the one people turned to when their world fell apart, and suddenly, his world had vanished. The first time his absence was felt in a tangible way was the Sunday after he disappeared. That morning, the sanctuary filled as usual. Families filed into pews, the choir gathered. The organist set her hands on the keys. But when the hour struck, the pulpit was empty. A heavy silence settled over the room. Some people stared at the door, half expecting him to walk through, straightening his tie and apologizing for being late. But the door never opened. Finally, one of the deacons stood and tried to lead a prayer, but his voice shook. The congregation joined in, voices breaking with fear and disbelief. That morning, people left the church in tears, holding their children a little tighter. From that moment, the absence of Pastor Thomas wasn't just a private family tragedy. It was a wound that cut through the entire town. And in a place like Ashford, where life was usually steady and predictable, a wound like that didn't just hurt, it festered. It turned people toward questions they didn't want to ask. Questions about faith, about trust, about who Thomas really was. Because if a man like him could vanish without explanation, what else could happen? For Mary, life became a blur of casseroles dropped off by well-meaning neighbors and long nights spent pacing the floor. She tried to shield the children, tried to keep their world as normal as possible, but the house felt hollow. The sound of the back door creaking open, the sound she had waited for on that first night, never came. And as the days stretched into weeks, and the weeks into months, the town began to shift. People still prayed for his safe return, but doubt began to creep in. Some whispered that maybe he had been carrying on a secret life. Others said maybe he had been silenced by whom, no one would say. The whispers grew louder when investigators found nothing, no body, no signs of struggle, no clear direction of where he had gone. A man had simply ceased to exist. Ashford had never known a mystery like this, and it wouldn't let go of them for decades. But what no one knew, not Mary, not the congregation, not even the investigators combing through his life, was that the answers weren't out there in the woods or hidden on some far-off road. The answers were in his own house, in his own study, written in his own hand. They were just waiting for someone to find them. The morning after Pastor Thomas vanished, Ashford woke up different. The sun rose over the town the same way it always did, spilling golden light over the church steeple and the sleepy houses. But for those who had already heard the whispers, there was a heaviness in the air, something that made the cicada's song feel more like a dirge than background noise. At the parsonage, Mary was running on fumes. She had never gone to bed. The night had been a blur of pacing, checking the door, checking the clock, calling his name softly into the backyard, as though he might just appear from the shadows. At some point, she sat at the kitchen table with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, the silence of the house pressing against her until she thought she might scream. When the first rays of sun touched the window, she made a decision. She called the police again. The officer who had come in the middle of the night returned, this time with a partner. They knocked politely, almost cautiously, and when Mary opened the door, their expressions told her everything she already feared. This wasn't just a man running late. This was a missing person. The children padded into the kitchen in their pajamas, rubbing their eyes. Mary forced a smile, poured them bowls of cereal, and tried to keep her voice steady. She didn't tell them their father was missing. Not yet. She just said he'd gone out early. By mid-morning, word had spread. A few neighbors came by to check on Mary. One brought a pot of coffee, another some toast and jam, though no one had much of an appetite. By the time the church bell tolled 10 a.m., the little front lawn of the parsonage had turned into an impromptu gathering spot. And that's when the questions began. When was the last time you saw him? Did he take his car? Could he have gone to visit someone? Mary answered as best she could, but her words felt thin. He had kissed the children goodnight. He had gone into his study. And then, nothing. The police began their work. They checked the study again. They combed through the church, even the dusty corners of the basement. They walked the property, peered into the woods that edged the parsonage yard. They found no sign of forced entry, no broken window, no muddy footprints. The only thing they noticed was that his notebook, the one he had been carrying that evening, was missing. By afternoon, the Ashford Sheriff's Department officially opened a missing persons case. The first search party was small. A handful of officers, a few volunteers, flashlights, and 2 hounds brought in from a nearby county. The dogs sniffed his clothes, circled the yard, and barked into the trees, but after an hour, they lost the trail. The men fanned out through the woods anyway, calling his name into the humid air. "Pastor Albright." "Thomas." The forest answered only with the rustle of leaves and the calls of crows. Back at the house, Mary sat on the edge of her bed, clutching her husband's pillow. The children played on the floor, too young to fully understand, though their eyes flicked to their mother with a kind of quiet unease. Kids sense more than we think. By evening, the town had grown restless. Rumors sprouted quickly, as they always do in small towns. At the diner, people leaned close over coffee cups, whispering theories. Some said he must have gone off to pray in solitude and lost his way. Others muttered darker possibilities that someone had taken him, or worse. By nightfall, the first of many vigils was held. The congregation gathered in the sanctuary, candles in hand, their faces lit by flickering light. Hymns rose into the rafters, trembling and raw. People prayed aloud, some in sobs, some in near whispers. And all the while Mary sat in the front pew, her face pale, her hands trembling around the candle that dripped wax onto the floor. The first 48 hours of any disappearance are critical. That's what investigators will tell you. And in those hours, the absence of evidence is its own kind of evidence. There was no broken lock, no signs of a struggle, no evidence that he had packed a bag or planned to leave. Which left only 2 possibilities. He left willingly, or someone took him. Neither option sat well with Ashford. By the 3rd day, the search expanded. More volunteers joined, combing through cornfields, barns, and back roads. Flyers went up on telephone poles and grocery store windows. His photo, a black and white portrait from the church directory, stared back at people from every corner of town. Some swore they saw him, claimed to have glimpsed a man matching his description, walking down a county road or standing at the edge of the woods. Each report fizzled out. Each sighting was a dead end. For the first time, Ashford felt vulnerable. If something could happen to Pastor Thomas, the man who represented stability and faith, what did that mean for the rest of them? Children were kept inside after dark. Porch lights burned later into the night. People locked their doors who had never bothered with locks before. And through it all, Mary waited. She sat up at night in the study, staring at his open Bible, her mind circling around the same questions. Why had he left the glasses he couldn't read without? Why had he taken his notebook but not his wallet? Why had there been no note, no sign, no goodbye? Each question was a stone in her chest, pressing heavier with every passing hour. Investigators interviewed her again and again, each time more insistent. Had he been under stress? Had they argued? Was there anything at all that might explain why he left? Her answer never changed. He wasn't the kind of man to just leave. But whispers in town began to shift. People started to wonder if she really knew her husband as well as she thought. Because in Ashford, secrets had a way of surfacing, and some believed Thomas had been keeping one. The first week ended without answers, and in that silence, fear grew into something darker. Ashford was no longer simply searching for a missing pastor. They were staring into the possibility that something terrible, maybe unthinkable, had happened right in their own backyard. And as the days turned into weeks, the questions only deepened. Where was Pastor Thomas? Why had he vanished? And what, exactly, was written in the missing notebook he carried into the night? When the search failed to turn up anything, no clothing, no footprints, no body, the silence left behind was filled with whispers. And in Ashford, whispers had a way of spreading like wildfire. At first, people tried to keep the talk respectful. After all, Pastor Thomas had been beloved by many. He baptized their children, presided over their weddings, buried their dead. But as days turned into weeks, respect began to erode, replaced by suspicion, curiosity, and the uneasy thrill of scandal. It started at the diner, where old men nursed their coffee a little longer than usual, leaning across tables to share theories. Maybe he just ran off, one would say, lowering his voice. With who? Another would counter. He had a wife, 2 kids. He wasn't the type. You don't know what a man's capable of when he's under pressure. Soon, the beauty salon was buzzing with its own theories. Women under hair dryers speculated in hushed tones, glancing toward the door to make sure no one was listening. Some insisted he'd been kidnapped, a stranger passing through town perhaps. Others pointed out that his wallet had been left behind, which made little sense if he had left voluntarily. A few even suggested that maybe he'd gotten himself involved with someone he shouldn't have, an affair, a secret relationship, something that had finally caught up with him. And then there were the darker theories. One man at the gas station muttered about cults, claiming he'd read about groups recruiting pastors in rural towns, luring them into strange practices. Another swore he'd seen a strange light in the woods the week before Thomas vanished, convinced it was tied to something not of this world. Each rumor carried its own weight, its own momentum, and as they spread, the neat picture of Pastor Thomas, steady, dependable, faithful, began to blur. Mary tried to ignore it. She focused on her children, tried to maintain routines, tried to keep her head above water, but she couldn't avoid the looks. The sideways glances when she walked into the grocery store, the hushed voices that fell silent when she entered a room. Some people pitied her. Others suspected she knew more than she was saying. Investigators weren't immune to the pull of theories either. With no physical evidence to guide them, they were forced to entertain possibilities that might have seemed absurd under different circumstances. Could he have been running from debt? Was he having an affair? Did he walk into the woods to end his life? Or had someone in the very town he served silenced him? The church community was especially torn. On Sunday mornings, the pews were still filled, but the energy had shifted. Without Thomas at the pulpit, the sanctuary felt hollow, even when others stepped in to lead. After services, people lingered in clusters in the parking lot, debating what they thought had happened. Some clung to faith, convinced he was alive and would return. They spoke of him like a lost sheep who would one day find his way home. Others admitted quietly that they believed he was dead. The only question was how. The longer he stayed missing, the bolder the rumors grew. One woman swore she'd seen him in another town, walking quickly down a side street, his collar turned up. Another claimed he'd been spotted at a bus station, carrying a small suitcase. Each sighting was investigated. Each turned out to be nothing. But still, the stories fed the fire. The sheriff's department, under pressure from the community, released a statement after the first month. They had found no evidence of foul play, but they also had no evidence that Thomas had left on his own. They urged anyone with information to come forward. Instead of clarity, the statement only fueled speculation. If there was no evidence of foul play, did that mean he left willingly? If he left willingly, what did that say about the man they thought they knew? And if he didn't leave willingly, where was the proof? In small towns, unanswered questions are fertile ground for imagination. And in Ashford, imagination began to twist into paranoia. There were whispers about secret ledgers in the church, money missing from the offering plates. Whispers about late-night visits Thomas supposedly made to parishioners' homes, though no one could prove it. Whispers about him walking the cemetery alone, speaking under his breath to no one. Whether any of it was true didn't matter. What mattered was that people wanted answers, and in the absence of answers, they invented them. Mary bore the brunt of it. Some women from the church stopped visiting her, unsure what to say. Others came too often, pressing her with questions she couldn't answer. And always, there was the lingering suspicion, spoken or not, that maybe she knew something she wasn't telling. The children, too, began to feel it. At school, classmates whispered that their father had run away, or worse. One boy said his older brother claimed the pastor was buried out in the woods. The cruelty of children, often just echoes of what they heard at home, cut deeply. Through it all, Mary held fast. She refused to believe Thomas had abandoned them. She refused to believe he had been anything other than the man she knew, faithful, devoted, good. But in the quiet of night, lying awake in the parsonage that felt emptier with each passing day, even she began to wonder. Not because she believed the rumors, but because she had no answers. And in the absence of answers, the mind goes to dark places. Theories multiplied, rumors spread, and with each passing week, the line between truth and speculation grew thinner. Ashford wasn't just searching for a missing pastor anymore. They were wrestling with the possibility that the man they had trusted with their souls might not have been who they thought he was. And beneath it all, the unspoken fear lingered. If Pastor Thomas could vanish without a trace, who else could? In the early days after Pastor Thomas vanished, the church became the anchor. People gathered there almost daily, not just on Sundays, but in the evenings, in the mornings. whenever the weight of the uncertainty became too much to carry alone. They lit candles, sang hymns, prayed in circles, their voices trembling but united. For a little while, it felt like faith could hold the pieces together. But faith, especially in the face of silence, has its limits. And as the weeks dragged into months, those limits began to crack. It began quietly. A disagreement here, a whispered criticism there. At first, no one wanted to admit it, but the question hung heavy in the sanctuary. How long could they wait for a pastor who might never return? One Sunday morning in September, 2 months after his disappearance, the question came to a head. The service was being led by one of the deacons, a soft-spoken man named Harold Jennings. He stumbled through the sermon, his voice uncertain, his hands shaking as he turned the pages of his notes. When the benediction finally came, there was a tension in the room that couldn't be ignored. In the parking lot afterward, a woman named Mrs. Carter, a longtime member of the congregation, said what others had been too polite to say. "This church can't go on like this," she muttered, her voice sharp. "We need a real pastor. We can't just wait around forever." Others gasped, some in agreement, some in disapproval. But the words had been spoken aloud, and there was no taking them back. From that day on, a divide began to grow. On one side were those who believed Thomas would return. They clung to faith, convinced he was still out there, that he had been taken or lost but would come back to them. For these people, replacing him felt like betrayal. It was as though giving up hope meant admitting he was dead. On the other side were those who believed the church needed to move forward. They argued that Thomas, whatever had happened to him, was gone. The church had bills to pay, programs to run, a congregation to shepherd. They couldn't linger in limbo forever. Meetings turned tense. Conversations that once had been friendly became sharp. Neighbors who had sung together in the choir now avoided one another in the grocery store aisle. Mary, caught in the middle, felt the tension acutely. She wanted to believe her husband would return, but she also couldn't bear the whispers, the ones that suggested she was the reason the church was stuck, that her grief was holding everyone else back. It all came to a head one chilly evening in October, during a congregational meeting in the fellowship hall. Folding chairs filled the space, the smell of coffee and casserole lingering from the potluck earlier in the night. At the front, the deacons stood in a line, their faces drawn and weary. "We need to vote," one of them finally said, his voice tight. "Do we move forward with finding an interim pastor, or do we continue as we are?" The room erupted. "He's coming back," shouted one man near the back. "You don't know that," snapped another. "We're floundering without leadership." "You're abandoning him." "You're abandoning us." Voices overlapped, rising into a clamor. Some people stood, pointing fingers. Others wept quietly, their heads in their hands. Mary sat in the front row, her hands clenched in her lap, her face pale. She wanted to shout, to beg them to stop, but her voice wouldn't come. She felt the fracture tearing through the community her husband had built, and she was powerless to stop it. The vote was never finished that night. The shouting became too much, and people began filing out, slamming doors behind them, but the damage was done. The church that had once been united under Thomas's steady hand was now split down the middle. From that point forward, the fracture deepened. Some families stopped attending altogether, unwilling to choose a side. Others left for neighboring churches, seeking stability elsewhere. Attendance dropped. The offering plates grew lighter. And with every empty pew, the absence of Pastor Thomas felt sharper, like a wound that refused to heal. The whispers grew darker, too. Some began to say it wasn't just a disappearance. Maybe there was sin in the church itself. Maybe his vanishing was a punishment. One woman even claimed she'd had a dream in which Thomas stood at the pulpit, his eyes hollow, his voice warning them that the church was cursed. She told the dream to anyone who would listen, and soon it became another piece of lore, another whisper feeding the fire. Meanwhile, investigators had little new to offer. The case was growing colder by the day, and their presence in town was less frequent. With no updates, the community turned inward, chewing on its own fears, suspicions, and superstitions. By Christmas, the congregation was a shadow of what it had been. The sanctuary, once packed and joyful, was half empty. Candles still flickered, carols were still sung, but the weight of loss hung heavy in the air. Mary sat with her children in the front pew, staring at the pulpit where her husband had once stood. She tried to imagine him there, smiling at the choir, lifting his voice in song. But the image felt like a memory from another lifetime. The church had fractured, the town had changed. And through it all, the mystery of Pastor Thomas's disappearance loomed, unanswered, like a dark cloud that refused to break. But the truth was still there, buried deep, waiting for the day the house would finally give up its secret. By the spring of 1978, it was clear that Pastor Thomas wasn't coming back. The search parties had ended. The flyers had yellowed and curled at the edges, peeling from telephone poles. The sheriff's department had followed every lead they could. Sightings, tips, even psychic claims phoned in from out of state, and each one had gone nowhere. The case was declared inactive, though not officially closed. That was the language law enforcement used, but for Mary, it felt like a death sentence. Inactive meant no one was looking anymore. No one was calling her with updates. No one was knocking on her door with new questions. The silence was louder than anything. For the first year, Mary still kept the porch light on every night. It was a habit she couldn't break a beacon, just in case he found his way back. But after 12 months, she stopped. The bulb burned out one evening, and she let it stay dark. The children adjusted in ways children always do, but not without scars. Her son, just 7 when his father vanished, grew quiet and watchful, carrying the weight of responsibility no child should have to bear. Her daughter, 5 at the time, asked questions Mary couldn't answer. Where did Daddy go? Why didn't he say goodbye? Mary did her best. She told them their father loved them, that he hadn't wanted to leave, that she didn't know where he was, but she believed he was with God. Some nights, she even believed her own words. Other nights, she lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind circling the same unanswerable questions until morning. The church never truly healed. Attendance continued to dwindle, and within 5 years of Thomas's disappearance, Ashford Community Church was a shadow of its former self. A new pastor eventually came, but the congregation was fractured, suspicious, less trusting. Some families had left for good, and those who remained carried the loss with them like a ghost in the sanctuary. And Mary, well, she learned to live with absence. She found part-time work at the town library. She raised her children as best she could. She attended the new pastor's sermons but rarely spoke. For years, she wore her wedding band, her hopes stubborn, even as the world around her moved on. Every now and then, the case would flicker back to life. A body found in another county. A man fitting his description seen walking a roadside. Each time, the sheriff would call her, ask her to confirm whether it could be him. Each time, the answer was no. And with every false lead, the silence pressed heavier. By the late 80s, Ashford barely spoke of it anymore. New families had moved to town who didn't even know the story. Children who had once whispered about the missing pastor grew up, left home, built lives elsewhere. The mystery became more like a shadowed corner of town history, known only to those who had been there. But for Mary, and for her children, it never faded. Birthdays came and went, graduations, weddings, the empty space where Thomas should have been sat like a missing chair at the table. On her son's wedding day, Mary sat in the front pew, her hands trembling, watching her boy say vows his father should have been there to hear. Later that evening, when everyone else was laughing and dancing, she slipped outside alone and looked up at the stars, whispering, "You should be here." Her daughter had children of her own, grandchildren Thomas would never hold. They grew up hearing stories of the grandfather they never met, a man described in fragments, his calm voice, his steady hands, his quiet smile. To them, he was almost a legend. As the years turned into decades, the world changed. New presidents, new wars, new technologies. But in the parsonage, time seemed to freeze. Mary never moved from the house. She couldn't bring herself to. She kept his study just as he had left it, dust gathering on the books, his glasses still on the desk. She vacuumed the carpet, washed the curtains, but she never disturbed the desk itself. It felt sacred, untouchable. Neighbors whispered that she was trapped in the past, unable to let go. But for her, it wasn't about clinging to the past. It was about keeping faith with the man she had loved, even if she no longer knew who he had truly been. In the 90s, a new detective took a brief interest in the case, hoping to make a breakthrough with fresh eyes. He interviewed Mary again, went through the files, retraced old steps. But after months of digging, he too found nothing. The trail was simply too cold. By then, Thomas had been gone for nearly 20 years. The world outside saw Mary as a widow, though no death certificate had ever been issued. Inside, she still felt suspended, not a wife, not a widow, not anything that fit neatly into words. Just a woman caught in between, her life marked by a question that had no answer. Her children grew older, built families, moved on in ways she never could. They visited often, brought the grandchildren to see her, but whenever the kids wandered too close to the study, she called them back sharply, her voice trembling. "Not in there," she'd say. "That's your grandfather's room." And still, the years passed. By the time the new millennium arrived, the story of Pastor Thomas had become a local legend, the kind told in whispers by teenagers daring each other to walk past the parsonage at night. Some said his ghost haunted the study. Others said he'd been murdered and buried under the church. The truth, lost to time, had morphed into folklore. Mary aged. Her hair silvered, her steps slowed. She no longer worked at the library, no longer drove. But she stayed in the house, the study always locked, the desk always waiting. She never remarried, she never left Ashford. To the town, she became a figure of quiet tragedy, the woman whose husband had vanished, who never got answers, who lived her life in a house filled with silence. But in the summer of 2024, everything changed. Because the house that had held its secrets for nearly half a century was about to give one up. Beneath the floorboards of that study, untouched for decades, a journal waited. And when it was finally discovered, it would unravel everything the town thought it knew. By the summer of 2024, the parsonage had stood for more than a century. It was a plain two-story house with white clapboard siding and a wide porch, the kind of place you'd drive past without much thought. For years, it had been tied inseparably to the story of Pastor Thomas's disappearance, a house frozen in time, heavy with unanswered questions. When Mary passed away earlier that year, her children were faced with the task no child ever looks forward to, sorting through a lifetime. The house was still full of her things, her kitchenware, her furniture, her boxes of photographs, and of course, the study. For nearly 47 years, Mary had kept that room like a shrine. Dust had settled on the bookshelves, the curtains had yellowed in the sun, but she had never changed a thing. His Bible still lay open on the desk. His glasses still sat beside it. The chair was still tucked in, as though he might return at any moment to sit down and resume his work. It was eerie walking into that room. Her children, now middle-aged themselves, admitted they felt a chill just standing in it. For decades, they had been told not to touch anything in there, not to disturb the sacred order of their father's belongings. Now, faced with the task of clearing out the house, they felt like intruders in their own childhood home. They decided to hire a contractor to help with renovations before selling the property. The house needed work, peeling wallpaper, sagging floors, wiring that hadn't been touched since the 70s. The contractor, a local man who'd worked on dozens of old homes in Ashford, brought a small crew to begin repairs. On a humid morning in July, one of the workers was tasked with replacing the warped floorboards in the study. As he pried up the first board near the desk, he noticed something unusual, a hollow sound beneath the wood. He paused, tapped again, then leaned down closer. The gap wasn't just a normal crawl space, it sounded deliberate. Curious, he pulled up a few more boards, and that's when he saw it. A small, hidden compartment. Inside was a weathered leather-bound book. Dust coated its surface, and the leather was cracked with age, but the initials T.A. were still faintly visible on the cover. The worker set it gently on the desk, unsure what he had found. When the children arrived later that afternoon, the contractor showed them. Their breath caught as they stared at the book. It was their father's handwriting. The pages inside were yellowed and brittle, the ink faded but still legible. The first entries were neat, almost meticulous, prayers, reflections on scripture, notes about sermons. But as they turned the pages, the handwriting grew messier, the words darker, sentences trailed off, paragraphs broke into fragments. And in the margins were scrawled lines that didn't sound like the father they remembered at all. The children called the sheriff's department. Within hours, investigators were in the house, carefully photographing and cataloging the discovery. For the first time in nearly 5 decades, the case of Pastor Thomas Albright was reopened. The journal, it seemed, had been waiting all along, hidden just beneath their feet, while generations of grief and speculation unfolded above. News of the discovery spread quickly through Ashford. At the diner, people leaned over their coffee cups with wide eyes. At the salon, women whispered under the hum of hair dryers. Even those too young to remember the original disappearance felt the weight of it. The journal was like a ghost's voice, reaching out from the past. The first reports were cautious. Investigators said only that the journal contained personal writings from Pastor Thomas, and that they were being analyzed for relevance to the case. But that was enough to set the town ablaze with speculation once more. What could the journal reveal? Was it a confession? A farewell note? Evidence of foul play? For Mary's children, the discovery was bittersweet. For so long, they had lived without answers, their lives defined by an empty chair at the table. Now, here was a piece of their father's voice, preserved in his own hand. But reading it was unsettling. The man in those pages did not always sound like the man they remembered. Some passages were ordinary lists of parishioners he planned to visit, notes on sermons about forgiveness and faith, but others were strange. Descriptions of sleepless nights, paranoia about being followed. Cryptic lines like, "The shadows gather at the edge of the woods again. I fear they know." What did it mean? Who were they? What did he fear? The investigators worked carefully, cataloging each page, photographing each entry. They consulted handwriting experts, archivists, even psychologists to analyze the writings. The journal became the center of a mystery that had lain dormant for nearly half a century. And for the people of Ashford, it was both thrilling and terrifying. Because if the journal held the truth about what happened to Pastor Thomas, that truth might not be simple, it might not be comforting. It might reveal that the man they had trusted with their faith had been keeping secrets all along. And the darkest part? The journal had been hidden, intentionally, beneath the very room where his wife had waited for him to return. The house had kept its secret for 47 years, and now that secret was about to rewrite everything. The first thing investigators noticed about the journal was how ordinary it seemed at the beginning. The early entries read like the private reflections of a pastor trying to guide his congregation and himself. Pages were filled with notes on scripture, drafts of sermons, prayers for members of the church. His handwriting was steady, neat, almost elegant. "Lord, grant me patience with Brother Miller, who struggles with his temper. Remind me to visit Mrs. Hayes, she has been ill. Sunday sermon, Matthew 5, blessed are the meek." If the journal had ended there, it would have been nothing more than a time capsule of a man doing his work. But as investigators turned the pages, the tone began to change. The handwriting grew looser, more frantic. Sentences broke apart, thoughts spilled into the margins. And what emerged was a picture of a man under strain, a man who seemed to be carrying a burden no one else knew about. One entry read, "The nights are long again. I hear them outside, though Mary does not. She says it is the wind, but I know better. I see the shapes near the trees, watching, always watching." Another, "I am not sure how much longer I can keep the facade. They believe me steady, calm, faithful, but they do not know the shadows that press at me when the house grows quiet. I pray, but the silence grows heavier." The investigators circled these passages, noting the shift from pastoral to paranoid. Was this the rambling of a tired man, overworked and overstressed? Or was there something more? As the entries moved into the summer of 1977, the tone darkened further. "Someone followed me home tonight. Footsteps behind me, steady, deliberate. I turned, but the road was empty. I do not know who they are, but I feel their eyes. I cannot confide in Mary. She worries enough. But I fear I have led them here, into the heart of our home. The church is no refuge. The walls are thin, and their whispers seep through." And then, one entry that sent chills through everyone who read it. "If they find this, know that I tried to resist. Know that I did not go willingly. The Lord knows my heart. The truth lies beneath the floor." That line, "The truth lies beneath the floor," struck investigators like a lightning bolt. It was a riddle, written by a man who would vanish days later. And for nearly half a century, it had been hidden beneath the very floor where he wrote it. Psychologists brought in to examine the journal debated what it meant. Some believed Thomas was experiencing a mental breakdown, his mind unraveling under the weight of responsibilities and private fears. Others argued that his paranoia might have been rooted in reality, that someone truly was following him, threatening him, closing in. The entries in the final week before his disappearance were the most disturbing of all. "They came again last night. I heard the boards creak in the hallway, though the children slept sound. The study window rattled, though the air was still. I do not know how long I can keep them out. I confess nothing. I will confess nothing. But if they silence me, it will be because of what I know. I have written it here, scattered in these pages, hidden in plain sight. Forgive me, Lord. Protect Mary and the children. My time grows short. The final entry, dated July 10th, 1977, 2 days before he vanished, was short. The shadows are inside now. No signature, no farewell, just those words, scrawled in handwriting so jagged it was barely legible. For investigators, the journal raised more questions than it answered. Was Pastor Thomas losing his mind, or had he truly been threatened by someone or something in Ashford? For his children, it was even harder. To read their father's words was to feel him again, to hear his voice across time. But that voice was not steady or reassuring. It was fearful. It was breaking. The journal became the centerpiece of the reopened case. Experts combed through every line, searching for clues, names, places, hidden codes. Some believed the cryptic passages might conceal real information, disguised as paranoia. Others thought it was nothing more than the diary of a man sliding into madness. The townspeople, too, speculated endlessly. Some clung to the idea that his words were metaphor, the ramblings of an overworked pastor. Others were convinced the journal was a confession, proof that he had known something dangerous, something worth killing him for. And then there were those who whispered about the supernatural. They pointed to the line about shadows, about whispers in the walls. They spoke of curses, hauntings, forces that had been waiting in the house for decades. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. The journal had reopened a wound Ashford thought had scarred over. For nearly 50 years, people had lived with absence. Now, they were forced to confront the possibility that the absence had not been random, that their pastor had been keeping secrets, that his disappearance was not just a mystery, but the end of a story he had been writing himself. And buried within the journal, scattered across those frantic pages, lay the pieces of a puzzle investigators were determined to solve. Because if Pastor Thomas was right, if the truth really was hidden there, then after nearly half a century, Ashford might finally learn what happened on that summer night in 1977. For weeks after the discovery of the journal, the sheriff's office became the center of gravity in Ashford once again. The leather-bound book was photographed, transcribed, and copied. Experts from outside the county were brought in: forensic document examiners, psychologists, even a historian familiar with church records from the 70s. Each was tasked with one goal: to make sense of Pastor Thomas's final words. On the surface, the journal was fragmented, messy, riddled with paranoia. But hidden in the tangle of ink and half-finished sentences, investigators believed there might be a thread of truth. One of the first things they noticed was how Thomas's paranoia seemed to escalate after certain dates. Cross-referencing his entries with church records revealed something curious. Many of the darkest entries coincided with nights after deacons' meetings or after financial decisions had been made. For example, one passage read, "The pressure grows unbearable. They ask questions I cannot answer. I fear they already suspect. The ledgers tell more than I intended." When investigators pulled the church's old financial books, they noticed discrepancies, small at first, but consistent. Money unaccounted for, offerings that didn't line up with deposits. Had Thomas uncovered theft in his own church? Or had he been implicated in it? It was a thread worth tugging. Another entry seemed to reference a name, though written cryptically. H.J. comes again, pressing harder. He says the matter cannot be ignored, but his eyes hold no mercy. I fear his path leads to ruin. H.J. The initials jumped out immediately. Investigators went back through church rosters and deacons' minutes. One name fit perfectly: Harold Jennings, the deacon who had led several services after Thomas vanished. Was Jennings pressuring him? About money? About something else? Jennings had died in the late 90s, so he couldn't be questioned. But the connection raised eyebrows, especially since Harold had been one of the loudest voices pushing to move forward without Thomas. The deeper investigators dug, the more unsettling connections they found. An entry from early July 1977 read, "They say the land is not ours, that the deed was a lie. I never should have signed, but I trusted them, and now the weight of it falls squarely on me." This sent investigators into property records. After days of combing through courthouse archives, they found that the land beneath Ashford Community Church had indeed been disputed in the 70s. A legal battle had arisen between the church and a neighboring farm over property lines. The matter had been settled quietly, but not before tensions flared. Had Thomas been caught in the middle? Had he signed something that made enemies? And then there were the strangest entries of all the ones about shadows, whispers, footsteps. One line in particular stood out. "The man by the fence does not speak. He only watches. Night after night, the same spot. When I approach, he is gone, yet the grass is always trampled." Investigators checked police reports from that summer. To their surprise, a neighbor had once called in about a prowler near the parsonage, reported just a week before Thomas vanished. The responding deputy had found nothing, but the call was real. Could Thomas's paranoia have been rooted in actual stalking? Piece by piece, the journal began to look less like the ramblings of a man losing his mind and more like a map, a chaotic, frightened map of the pressures closing in on him. Money, property disputes, power struggles within the church, and maybe someone watching him from the shadows. But then came the most chilling connection of all. An entry from July 9th, 3 days before he disappeared. "I told M to lock the doors tonight. I cannot keep her in the dark much longer. If anything happens, she must know the truth lies beneath." M, almost certainly Mary. But Mary had never mentioned her husband warning her about anything, never mentioned him telling her to lock the doors. Had she forgotten? Had she been protecting him? Or had Thomas written the entry but never actually spoken the words aloud? When investigators re-interviewed the children now in their 50s, both swore their mother had never once said anything about a warning, which left a disturbing possibility. Had Thomas intended to tell her, but vanished before he could? The journal didn't offer neat answers, but it painted a picture: a man burdened by secrets, pressured by powerful figures in his own church, haunted by someone who might have been watching him, and convinced that danger was closing in. For the first time in nearly half a century, investigators felt they were circling something real. Theories emerged. Some believed Harold Jennings or others in church leadership had discovered Thomas knew too much about money, about land, about hidden dealings, and silenced him. Others believed the prowler was the key, that someone outside the church had targeted him for reasons still unclear. And a few, reading the journal's most cryptic lines, whispered that maybe the answers weren't of this world at all. But whichever theory you believed, one truth was undeniable. The journal had turned Ashford's coldest case into a living mystery again. And as investigators connected the dots, they began to close in on a picture of what might really have happened on that summer night in 1977. A picture that, when revealed, would shatter the town all over again. The deeper investigators dug into the journal, the clearer it became. Pastor Thomas hadn't simply vanished into the night. He had been pulled into something much darker, something that had been festering inside Ashford for years. The breakthrough came when a retired deputy, now in his 80s, came forward after reading about the rediscovery of the journal in the local paper. He had been young back in 1977, fresh on the force, when the call about the prowler at the parsonage came in. He admitted that at the time, he dismissed it, figured it was just a neighbor's kid or a drunk wandering too close. But what he remembered, all these years later, was the way Thomas looked when he arrived that night. He wasn't just scared, the deputy recalled. He looked trapped, like a man who knew something was coming for him. That testimony, combined with the journal, convinced investigators to re-examine everyone in Thomas's orbit during that summer. They started with the deacons. Records showed that Harold Jennings, H.J., in the journal had been unusually forceful in those last months. He'd pushed aggressively for Thomas to resolve the land dispute with the neighboring farm, signing paperwork that shifted boundaries in ways that benefited certain members of the church financially. When Thomas hesitated, the pressure increased. And then, money began to vanish from the church's accounts. The ledgers, once balanced, started showing irregularities. According to the journal, Thomas had noticed, and he had written about his fear that the truth in the books would destroy them all. But who was them? Investigators dug into the deacon's finances. Though Jennings had long since passed, they found traces of suspicious transactions tied to his family unexplained cash deposits that coincided with the missing church funds. It wasn't just Jennings. 2 other deacons from that era, both long gone, had also benefited from land deals surrounding the church. Quiet purchases, shifts in boundary lines. It painted a picture of corruption, small-town men using the church to enrich themselves. And Thomas had known. That knowledge might have made him dangerous. His journal suggested he had resisted signing certain papers and refused to look the other way. He had even written, "I cannot serve both God and their greed. If I speak, they will turn on me. If I stay silent, I am complicit. The chilling possibility emerged that Thomas hadn't been silenced by outsiders, or by random chance. He may have been silenced by the very men who stood beside him at the pulpit. The pieces aligned too neatly. A pastor growing paranoid, a prowler outside his home, deacons with money to lose. A journal hidden under the floorboards, perhaps because Thomas knew someone in his own church couldn't be trusted. But the most damning revelation came from one final record. Buried in courthouse archives was a property transfer from 1977, just weeks before Thomas disappeared. The buyer? A shell name, barely disguised. The seller? Ashford Community Church. The land transferred was small, a sliver near the edge of the property line, but it contained access rights to a valuable well. The paperwork bore one signature that stood out: Thomas Albright. Investigators compared the signature to known samples. Something was off. The slant was wrong, the strokes shaky. A handwriting expert confirmed what they suspected. The signature had likely been forged. If Thomas had discovered the forgery, if he had confronted the men responsible, it could explain everything. The journal entries in those final days grew more desperate, more fearful. The shadows may not have been literal at all. They may have been men he once trusted, lurking near his home, watching him, waiting. So what happened on the night of July 12, 1977? No one could say with absolute certainty. But investigators now believe this. Thomas likely uncovered financial corruption within his own church. He may have confronted the men involved, and when he refused to be silent when he became a liability, those men made sure he disappeared. Whether he was lured from his home that night, or dragged from it, was unclear. Whether his body was buried in some forgotten patch of land, or hidden in a place no one ever thought to look, remained a mystery. But the motive was there. The fear in his journal was real, and the silence of the last 47 years spoke volumes. When the findings were shared with the public, Ashford reeled. Some were horrified, others skeptical. Many of the men implicated were long dead, their families still in town. Old wounds split open, old loyalties clashed. Some parishioners refused to believe their church leaders could have done such a thing. Others admitted, quietly, that they had always suspected something wasn't right. For Thomas's children, the revelation was both devastating and clarifying. The man they had lost hadn't abandoned them. He hadn't gone mad. He had been a man of conscience, standing against corruption. And for that, he had paid the ultimate price. The sheriff's office made one final statement. While the disappearance of Pastor Thomas Albright remains officially unsolved, evidence suggests he was the victim of foul play connected to financial misconduct within the church at the time. We may never recover his remains, but we now have reason to believe his disappearance was not voluntary and not without cause. It wasn't justice. Not fully. Too many years had passed, too many men had gone to their graves without answering for what they'd done. But for the first time in nearly half a century, the truth, or at least part of it, had come to light. And Ashford would never see its church, or its history, the same way again. When the sheriff's office released their findings, the town of Ashford reacted the way small towns always do, with a mix of relief, denial, and whispers that refused to die. For Thomas's family, there was relief in finally knowing he hadn't abandoned them. The journal proved it. His last thoughts were of fear for their safety, of love for them, of a man trying to shield his wife and children from a danger closing in. He hadn't run away. He hadn't chosen silence. He had been silenced. But relief didn't erase grief. The wound of 47 years could not be stitched shut with a single press release. His son, now in his 50s, said it best when he stood before reporters. "My father stood for what was right. He was taken from us for that. I only wish those responsible were still alive to face justice." Mary never lived to hear the truth. That fact gnawed at her children. For decades, she had borne the weight of whispers that her husband had left, that maybe she had known more than she admitted. She had died without answers. In a way, the truth came too late. For Ashford, the revelations cut deep. The church had been the town's foundation, its source of unity. To learn that men at its very heart had betrayed both their pastor and their people felt like a second death. Some parishioners, especially the younger ones, accepted the findings. They spoke openly about rebuilding, about reclaiming faith from the shadows of corruption. Others refused. They shook their heads, muttering that it was all lies, that Pastor Thomas must have simply lost his mind. For them, the truth was too heavy to accept. Still, There was a strange sense of peace in finally naming what had long been unspoken. The cold case was not solved in the clean way people wanted: no trial, no handcuffs, no neat ending. But it was no longer a void. It was a story. A tragic one, but a story that made sense of the silence. And yet there remained one detail. One entry in the journal, scrawled in the margins of a sermon draft, had puzzled investigators from the start. "The door beneath the floor is not mine. It was here before me, and what waits there should not be seen." At first, they dismissed it as metaphor, the ramblings of a paranoid mind. But when contractors had pulled up the floorboards to find the journal, they noticed something else. The compartment that had held the book was larger than it needed to be, too large for just one journal. The space extended deeper, boxed in by old wood. When they probed further, they realized it continued under the wall into a crawl space that had been sealed decades earlier. Investigators searched it carefully. No human remains were found, no evidence directly tied to Thomas's disappearance. But there were objects: an old lantern, a broken rosary, and a second, smaller notebook. This one, however, was too badly damaged to read. Water had warped the pages, ink smeared into illegible blots. Only one line, pressed deep into the paper with the force of a hand, could still be deciphered. It read, "She was never alone." The handwriting was Thomas's, but who was she? Mary? His daughter? Someone else entirely? The phrase lingered, haunting everyone who saw it. If Thomas had hidden this second notebook, was he trying to protect his family even more directly? Or was he recording something darker, something the journal alone didn't capture? No one could say. The house was eventually sold, renovated, and repainted. New families moved in. The study became just another room. The floorboards, repaired, gleamed with fresh polish. But some neighbors swore the light in that room still glowed late at night, as though a lamp had been left burning. For Thomas's family, the truth brought a measure of peace, but the mystery would never leave entirely. The journal gave them his voice back, a voice trembling with fear, yes, but also with faith and love. They clung to that. The town, too, carried on. Ashford continued to change, new generations growing up with only fragments of the story. But for those who remembered the summer of 1977, the memory never faded. Because a pastor had vanished, a journal had whispered from beneath the floor, and even after the truth came out, one haunting line remained unanswered. She was never alone. And sometimes, late at night, people in Ashford still ask themselves what Pastor Thomas really meant.